Hi, I'm Mia Russell, Executive Director of the Friends of Minidoka.
And I'm Rory Banyard, Executive Producer with North Shore Productions. And I've had the privilege of directing this film that we're about to watch about the Minidoka concentration camp. Minidoka, as many of you will know, is now a National Historic Site, and this film was commissioned by the National Park Service to better tell our story. In partnership with Friends of Minidoka, we're now engaged in producing an hour-long film for National Public Television about Minidoka. And we'll chat a little bit more about that after the screening.
At Friends of Minidoka, our mission is to preserve and protect the Minidoka site and educate the public about the civil liberties lessons and the history of the Japanese American incarceration. In many places, the incarceration is still a relatively unknown history, so we're excited to bring this project to life. Let's watch the film.
The day you walk through that gate, you know you lost something. There are some things in your heart that you can't forget.
We were afraid. You look like the enemy, but we're American citizens.
Imagine someone saying, you need to go to jail because you're Japanese American.
What did I have to do with Japan? Nothing. My family wasn't doing anything wrong, but we were paying for it.
Towers, searchlights, barbed wire fences around us. If they thought we were trying to escape, they had the right to shoot us.
We were stripped of our civil rights. We were stripped of everything. When that happens in America, that is a concentration camp.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
My dad had just purchased a home for $1,500. December 7th is the day we were moving in. And when that news came on, my dad's face, I just saw his face just drop.
Within hours, the FBI began raiding Japanese American homes up and down the West Coast.
We lived in fear because the FBI came and picked up many of the fathers of the families.
When my father was taken away, I don't think our family knew anything about where he was. This left my mother panicked as to what was going to happen to us.
They were shop owners, language teachers, Buddhist priests, law-abiding citizens. Why the FBI targeted them? They happened to be prominent in the community.
December 7th wasn't when Japanese American prejudice started. It was decades before that. In the early 1900s, there were alien land laws and exclusion acts that kept out Japanese immigrants, and you could not apply for citizenship if you wanted to.
The majority of Japanese, when they start coming here to this country in 1860, were farmers, laborers.
They worked hard, saved, and then invested in an operation in Japantown, starting a restaurant, a laundry, a hotel.
The Japanese lived in pretty much segregated areas like J-towns. So we were fairly isolated and largely unknown.
As long as we were laborers and working for them, no problem. When we became competition, that was a no-no for us. Then resentment, jealousy.
We were called the Yellow Peril. The newspapers, the billboards, everything was anti-Japanese.
The Japanese should be under armed guard to the last man and woman right now, and to hell with habeas corpus.
My parents had a grocery store, and my dad put up a big sign in the front window saying, "We are Americans."
A Jap's a Jap, whether he's an American citizen or not. I don't want any of them.
Our bank accounts were frozen. We could not leave our homes after 8 o'clock p.m. Many people had to close down their businesses because of the curfew.
All Japanese should be put in concentration camps for the remainder of the war. We want to keep this a white man's country.
The fate of Japanese Americans was sealed in 1942 when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066.
The West Coast commander designated the entire West Coast as a military exclusion zone, and then said anyone of Japanese ancestry would be excluded from that zone. And so you could be a newborn baby, or you could be a 90-year-old invalid.
2/3 of these Japanese Americans were citizens by birthright. With just a sweep of a pen and a couple words, you're no longer a citizen.
They said aliens and non-aliens. And we thought, who in the Sam Hill is non-aliens? That was us. They didn't dare say American citizens.
The government called it an evacuation. It wasn't an evacuation, it was a forced removal. An evacuation happens when the house is on fire and you've got to run for your safety. That's an evacuation.
To be told that they can only take what they could carry, they didn't even know where they were going. It was very terrifying for my parents.
My dad said, burn everything Japanese. So we start burning and burying everything.
My father, who had a fruit and vegetable stand, 2 of them, he had to close them down.
My parents had just bought a new tractor and delivery truck, and the crops were in. To have all of that just wiped out, taken away from them, was really devastating.
We got rid of our family possessions because General John DeWitt told us that we can only bring that which we can carry. And as a young boy, I couldn't carry very much. Most of the families got rid of everything. My mother and father in 1939 had purchased a General Electric radio, and $100 was big money at that time. They sold it to a policeman on the beat for $5. Working 15, 20, 30 years in America and having it all taken away suddenly.
Always the questions, well, why are they doing this to us? What did we do to deserve this? And of course, the answer is our face, our race.
Bainbridge Island was the first community to be rounded up and incarcerated. And they had only a week to prepare, pack, and be ready to leave.
Oh, it was difficult. It really was. I can't even find words to describe the feeling. You know, your home is your safe haven. We were herded onto the ferry and onto the train and never told us where we were going or how long we were going to be gone or anything.
We all got numbers, and we became numbers. We weren't people anymore. We were numbers.
There was nobody that stood up for us from outside of our community. If we dared to try to resist, they probably would have killed everybody, you know, without any hesitation.
The government set up 17 temporary detention facilities on the West Coast.
They drove us out to North Portland, and there we were in the ex-livestock yard.
they're living in horse stalls, and they fully expected my grandparents to be deported because they were resident aliens.
And I remember to this day the pungent odor of manure seeping through the floor, fly paper black with flies, barbed wire circling the building, army soldiers with fixed bayonet, and I, as a 9-year-old, looking at that, frightened.
They were saying, well, we're putting you here to protect you from people who might hurt you. Well, why were the guns pointed at us instead of at those people who are trying to hurt us?
One day, my father was a respectable businessman. He had a wife, a family, a car, a place in this society. He could vote. 2 weeks later, he was a prisoner in a camp surrounded by barbed wire.
We got orders towards the end of August to be ready to move. And they put us on old coal trains.
We were ordered to pull the window shades down. We were not to see where we were going. Headed east, that's all we knew.
It was a 2-day journey. We were covered with soot.
We were then ordered to deboard. We could see a sea of sagebrush. That's all we could see. And suddenly, army barracks. Hundreds and hundreds of army barracks. And somebody said that this is Minidoka.
There was a dust storm when we got off the train, and my mom grabbed my hand. I remember her saying to me, "Joni, this is our new home," and crying.
Minidoka, also called Hunt Camp, was one of 10 incarceration camps built to hold Japanese Americans from the West Coast.
Minidoka was not finished yet, but we had to move in there. And they didn't have the toilets or anything. Nothing was done.
It was really in the middle of nowhere. And there were 44 blocks, each block consisting of 12 barracks. Each barrack was 6 units from A to F. A mess hall in the middle, a laundry room in the middle, and we would eat together, we would shower together, we would do laundry together.
No privacy whatsoever, any place.
Including babies born in camp, the government imprisoned over 120,000 innocent people. Minidoka held over 13,000. Every summer, survivors and their families returned to Minidoka for an annual pilgrimage.
In our family of 5, this was our bedroom and home right here. The 5 of us in one room here.
I remember that we hung up blankets to separate, get a little privacy between your sister and yourself and things like that.
We had dust storms constantly, and we had so much dust that it would seep through the walls of the barracks.
When the wind blew, we would just suffocate in our quarters.
During the summertime, it would be boiling hot. In the wintertime, we would freeze. When it rained, we would just be in a slosh of mud.
People say, oh yeah, we complained about the food, we complained about the lodging. That wasn't it. The damage was psychological. Here you were with people, all in various stages of grief. They were in anger, they were in denial, they wanted to prove their loyalty, they were grieving the loss of their lives, because their lives were stolen by the government.
My father was so withdrawn, it really destroyed him. I didn't know about suicide at that time, but if there was a way, he may have ended his own life.
There's that 2 Japanese word, shikata ga nai, that means it cannot be helped. Whatever that's happening cannot be helped. And gaman, bearing the unbearable. Those two words we were brought up with.
I was born in an American concentration camp. I've been able to do things with my life because of the strength of my parents and their values.
I cannot admire more the pioneering spirit of the first generation. Amongst the hardship and the loss of freedom and being stripped of civil rights, the first generation Isays and the older Nisays tried to make it into a livable community.
Everyone took a job, anyone who could work. I mean, they hired firemen and policemen. My mother was a seamstress. I got a job as a waitress.
My grandpa Ozawa, he became the block captain. He recruited the people who had restaurants to become the cooks for the block.
Eventually they had schools and libraries. It was like a regular community.
The mess halls would be decorated beautifully with crepe paper for special occasions, and the young adults and adults would have their dances.
Let me see your batting position.
No, I'm no hitter. The baseball team was terrific. We used to beat the other teams like 21-1. I hate to brag anything, but it was just all Japanese, second generation, and playing against these white kids that's 6 feet. It was a thrill. The whole idea was that we wanted to just play so that we could get out of camp.
After a year and a half, the American government decided we were not spies, we were not dangerous, and they gave us one-day passes. We were able to go beyond the barbed wire.
We were able to leave camp during harvest months, and we worked hard for the Idaho farmers for not very much, pay. But it was, I believe, what saved my father.
In early 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was to be a segregated Japanese-American unit that would fight in Europe. They recognized that they had to have a process for Japanese Americans to leave the camps.
The government now wanted to enlist young Japanese American men in the army and to start moving other incarcerees to civilian life away from the West Coast.
And so they came up with the idea of a loyalty questionnaire.
Questions 27 and 28 were the ones that people talk about a lot. And the first one dealt with, are you willing to fight on behalf of the United States against all foes and enemies? And the second one was, do you swear all allegiance to the United States, and do you forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan?
How can we disavow something we never avowed to in the first place? Our allegiance is to America, and I think that many of them were insulted. How dare you ask me questions like that? I'm as good an American as you.
Those who responded with anything but an unqualified yes, yes, were branded as disloyal and were sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center, a maximum security prison in California.
It was quite an indignation for a lot of our parents to think that they wanted our boys after they had done all that to us. So there was quite a bit of controversy between the parents and the sons.
My dad volunteered without any hesitation because he was an orphan. He didn't have to get approval from his parents. And so he, without question, decided he needed to go. It was really about family honor, about hoping that they could prove their loyalty to this country.
the young man that was in our block. He was put in the penitentiary because he refused to join the army because he says, no, you take us out of our prison here at Minidoka, then I'll go and serve. People say he brought so much shame to the family, and I don't think of it that way. You know, courage comes in different forms.
For its size and length of service, the 442nd would become the most decorated unit in American military history.
All the while, their mothers and fathers were incarcerated in an American concentration camp.
Two of my brothers left camp to join the 442nd. And my brother Masaru was killed in action in Italy 2 weeks before Germany surrendered.
These young men at Minidoka were really celebrated. They were thought of as heroes. Their names were placed on an honor roll.
The loyalty questionnaire marked a turning point. Individuals and families could now apply to leave camp for school, work, or resettlement away from the West Coast. But by December 1944, there were still almost 8,000 people incarcerated at Minidoka.
The exclusion order that kept Japanese Americans off the West Coast was lifted in January 1945.
We were given $25 and a ticket back to Portland, or wherever we came from.
My mother used to tell me they took us there and we didn't want to go. And then they let us go and we had nowhere to go.
My grandfather, like many of the Issei's, lost their homes, their businesses, everything. It was extremely traumatic for him.
People were afraid to go back out into a world where they knew that they would be discriminated against, that they would be hated in many ways.
My teacher hated Japanese. Erase the blackboard, throw out the garbage, wipe up dust. 27 students in the class. I did all the dirty work. She hated me. We faced overt racial prejudice.
There were bullets fired into houses in Seattle. On Vashon Island, someone burned down a Japanese farmhouse.
Throwing rocks at me and being called those names left an indelible mark on me, a feeling of inferiority.
Despite widespread hostility, there were individuals and isolated communities who welcomed their Japanese American neighbors home. Yet, in most places on the West Coast, racism persisted.
My father was this businessman who was quite successful, who now could only become a janitor.
We got married in 1955. We went to rent an apartment, and the manager took one look at us and said, "Sorry, we don't rent to Japs," and banged in the door. That was 10 years after the war ended.
My parents are the generation that went through the Depression, went through the relocation, and then went through the closing of the camps. So they basically started over 3 times.
This is why a lot of the old folks, they were depressed.
It was like a rape of a community. And we behaved like victims. We were in denial. We were silent. We were angry. We committed suicide.
It was something that we kind of shut out of our life because it was more merciful to us to forget than to talk about it.
Within the community, there was a sense that we could be taken again. So do not call attention to ourselves. Do not do bad things, or we all could be taken again.
My parents, they never complained about anything. I don't know what they were feeling, really. I didn't hear a word from them. We didn't talk about it for 40 years. Imagine.
My youngest daughter, it was on December 7th, and she says, I hate Pearl Harbor Day because everybody turns around and looks at me like I'm the enemy. I said to her, honey, your daddy was a World War II hero. And she said, I thought he fought for Japan. So that was a kind of a revelation to us that we were not doing them a favor by keeping quiet.
I think the civil rights movement in the 60s really shifted things.
The Sansei particularly were saying that the government needed to recognize that what occurred was wrong, that they wanted restitution and an apology.
Jimmy Carter, in his final year in office as president, started a bipartisan commission to look into this 40 years after the fact.
Their findings from this commission was that, one, there was no military necessity, that the causes of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was war hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States.
Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, and it was the official apology and first step toward reparations to survivors only of this tragedy.
3 presidents signed letters of apology, and we got $20,000 each if you were alive when the act was passed. When that came out, all our parents had died. They're the ones that should have got that money. But most of them all died, and we benefited by it, which is not right, because they're the ones that suffered.
For most, the money wasn't even the issue. The apology was much more valuable.
It really helped me heal. It was like we were finally part of history.
Americans have to understand that freedom is very fragile. It's never to be taken for granted.
I remember on September 11, 2001, watching the news, and I'm hearing this is our generation's Pearl Harbor. And the first thing that went through my mind was, I hope not.
People used to call me names just on the street, and no one spoke up for me. No one said, hey, you can't call that kid that kind of name. That's wrong. And so the whole notion was, it's okay. It's okay to call these people names. That's the situation that's been created for Muslim Americans today. We, the Japanese, are not going to be taken again. That's done with. But other group will be taken for a different reason to a different place that's essentially the same. When you see the injustice happening, you need to stand up. When you see someone being called names in public, you need to stand up.
The wrongs of the incarceration will be perpetuated unless we do things to prevent it.
Now that I've told you my story, you have a piece of that legacy to stand up. You have a piece. And should it happen again, you cannot claim ignorance. You can either say, yeah, I'm for that, or no, I'm not. And I'm hoping that reason will rule, and they will see that injustices hurt us all.
We hope you enjoyed the film. Please stick around for a live Q&A with survivors of the camp in just a few minutes. But first, we just wanted to chat a little bit about the extended version of the film that we're currently working on.
So we filmed over 30 interviews with survivors and their descendants. And when we put together our first edit for the film, it was over 48 minutes long, I believe. And we had to lose just a ton of great content and insights to make this half-hour version. So we really wanted to give the story its due and also bring it to a larger audience, which is why we've engaged in this public television film. And we also really wanted to draw a strong connection between the human rights abuses that we're seeing today and the incarceration experience in World War II. And we've been able to film some great scenes of protest with Syria for Solidarity and others that will help make that connection for viewers. And we're very grateful to Friends of Minidoka for partnering with us on this project and helping to make it a reality.
So a big part of the mission at Friends of Minidoka is education, and we knew that this film would be a great tool for getting this history into classrooms nationwide. So we'll also be enrolling a curriculum package to accompany this film, which will consist of free online lesson plans based on 4 additional short films, primary resources, and activities that meet core curriculum standards for middle and high school students.
So we're heavily into post-production on the film with the goal of distributing it early next year. To learn more about our project, please visit the website, minidokafilm.com, where you can sign up for updates and support the project. And now let's hear from 2 of our survivors who will be available to answer your questions.
Hi, everyone. We're waiting for George to join us, but I'll just start by introducing myself. Again, I'm Mia Russell, Executive Director of the Friends of Minidoka, and I'm joining from Boise, Idaho.
And I'm Rory Banyard, the director of the film, and I'm joining from Portland, Oregon. And to my left is George Nakata, also joining from Portland, Oregon, who you saw in the film. And above George is, excuse me, Karen Harai Owen, who is joining from Twin Falls.
Hi, everybody.
And Karen, as you saw with her really cute baby pictures that were in the film, was born in Minidoka.
So maybe to start off, George, can you tell us what you were 9 years old, I think, when you were incarcerated. Can you tell us what your dominant memory of Minidoka was?
Well, spending 4 years behind barbed wires, of course, is an indelible experience. Even at that young age, you know when you're stripped of freedom, you know that something's wrong when you face barbed wires and guard towers. So it was quite an experience, both at the Portland Assembly Center as well as incarcerated in the Minidoka camp.
And can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, what the post-war years were like for you? What was it like to get back to Portland?
Well, in my case, when we arrived back in Portland, we lost everything. We no longer had our home in Japantown, so we became migrant workers. We picked berries and beans for our very survival. My father had 3 businesses prior to World War II. He was now reduced to making mashed potatoes all day long. The day after we returned, we went out to the Rose City Cemetery. We had an infant baby brother out there in Tombstone. When we arrived, all the tombstones were damaged and destroyed. We could not find his final resting place. And going back to school, as in the film, the teacher hated me. And it was indeed quite trying until the principal shifted me to a different room because he knew the abuse that I was taking from my teacher. And I had to regain my confidence in education when he switched homerooms for me. So those were some of the initial days after we returned back to Portland.
Thank you for sharing, George.
And Karen, you have a really unique story. There were very few families that stayed in Twin Falls. So could you briefly just tell us, maybe why your parents decided to stay in Twin Falls after being released from Minidoka?
Well, my parents left Minidoka in December of 44. My dad was offered a job as a farmhand on a farm outside of Twin Falls. And he had decided that we had nothing to go back to. I mean, they were truck farmers, everything was gone. So he moved us out of camp when I was a year and a half. And I had no idea growing up and going to grade school what Minidoka was about. I had no idea the kind of trauma that it inflicted on my parents because they covered it up, Japanese way, you don't talk about bad things. You don't teach your children your bad experiences. So we didn't know anything about camp, other than when we had relatives and friends who were in camp with mom and dad. They would load us in the car and we would go out there and look at this weedy, dusty place with the guard tower. And they never explained to us what that was. And, the reception area there. And they said, oh, you were born over here. And I'm like, okay. And that was it, And even going to high school, we never encountered the kind of racism that George did. My parents had a very protective group of friends who were, most of them were non-Asian. And, everybody's heard my story about my friend Bonnie Reed that we went to high school with. And one day we were in our 20s and she had dinner with us. And then she rushed home and woke her parents up and said, Mom, Dad, did you know the Hirais were Japanese? Well, her parents just burst out laughing. And she said later they asked her when did she figure it out? And she said, because we had Japanese food at the Hirais last night. But, that's the kind of place Twin Falls was for my family. There were other parts of it that I know Sharon Matsuda's father has talked about, that there were barbershops that had signs in them that said no Japs allowed. And after camp closed, all of the Japanese continued to boycott those barbershops. There were other businesses that were really kind to the Japanese, Safeway, local places, that Mother said they had war ration food coupons, rationing coupons, and some of the places would give them more than they had ration tickets for. And she always continued to support those businesses.
So I think we've been getting a couple of questions from the audience. So I think at this point, we can actually bring this question up on screen. So here's a great one to start with. For the survivors, what wisdom would you embark on Asian American activists who get pushback from our elders for rocking the boat when we press for systemic change in our social and legal systems? Do you have any thoughts to share on that one? Maybe George, I know you've been quite active lately in speaking out.
Well, I think we all agree that racial inequality is a very complex thing. It does exist. I don't think there's any denying that. I think we have to go back to the basics. In the first few paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal. And yet we have not followed that. And I think it gets down to tolerance. It gets down to understanding. It gets down to our own shift in our own personal conscience. And there may be 330 million people in the United States. And I think each one of us has to dig deep and change our own beliefs and believe in the fact that all men are created equal. And that's not a very easy thing to do, individual conscience, and to change our own inner behavior. And I see that playing out today in protests and so forth. So it's indeed a very complex situation, in my opinion.
I think that I need to comment. I think that if it hadn't been for the Sansei and some very progressive Niseis, there would not have been redress. In some ways, I think the Sanseis gave the Niseis permission to say, hey, this was wrong. I don't know that the Niseis would have done that on their own. I know I was in Los Angeles when the redress started, and there was not any opposition from the Niseis. Once the Sanseis started making efforts to get the redress rolling. But I don't know that if the Niseis would have done it on their own.
Well, my take is a little bit different. I was personal friends with Minoru Yasui. He was one of the champions for the entire redress movement. And it was not so much the redress in of itself. As the gentleman in the film mentioned, it was the apology. It was the United States of America taking a historic move and actually apologizing to a small ethnic group of Japanese having been incarcerated, not for military necessity, but because of our race. And that apology, and I still have that letter of apology, means more to me than anything else.
Oh. See, I don't think my parents would have ever instigated that themselves. But then growing up in Idaho, we don't even have a JCL in Twin Falls. So that might have fed into it.
We have a question from Corey Shiozaki, who wanted to know if anybody at Minidoka was shot by the MPs like they were at Manzanar. And I believe the answer to that is no, but perhaps Karen and George, you'd like to talk about the difference between the camps as you may have experienced it or heard about after the war, between the different WRA camps.
Well, I think all the camps were similar in a way, and yet they were different. For example, Tule Lake, a lot of people that answered no to the question number 28 were sent to Tule Lake, a far more disciplined camp. We had armed guards. We had 8 guard stations there in Minidoka with armed bayonets. 2 of them, I believe, had machine guns. So we, as young children, were told never to go even close to those guard stations. And it was very frightening to spend those early days. And as mentioned in film, they decided after a period of time that we Japanese were not spies. We were not dangerous. And they did give us one-day passes so that we could go beyond the barbed wires. But going beyond the barbed wires is nothing exciting. There's nothing out there but a sea of sagebrush. And all we could do is hunt for greasewood, because we're looking at coyote caves and rattlesnakes and scorpions and ticks. It was a wild, wild place. Today, there's farming there. But when we were there, it was a North Canal off of the Snake River. It was a wild, desolate, dry place. But in terms of the security, in Minidoka, we did not have any kind of shooting that I am aware of.
See, I have no memory of anything because I left when I was 1.5 years. So everything that I know about camp came from my parents later when I started going on the pilgrimages with my mom and from my aunties and my relatives.
Thank you. I think we've got a question now from Ken Mochizuki, and he says, what do you think of our Americans of Chinese descent being blamed for the coronavirus pandemic? Are we back to 1942?
Well, the Japanese culture is not a demonstrative culture. We don't march around with megaphones and signs. However, we can understand the protests that are going on today. I don't see any signs that say Asian lives matter. And at the same time, in 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act that forbid Chinese to come to America after all the great work they did in the gold mines of California and along the West Coast. So they have certainly taken their share of abuse when you really dig down to an American history. And it's a shame that our education system really doesn't detail out the details of our indigenous people, too much about slavery, about the incarceration, exclusion acts. And so I would hope that in the future, our children and our grandchildren would have the type of education that really teaches them true equality and diversity that they are not taught in schools today. That's my hope.
And that's a great, oh, go ahead, Karen.
No, I think that as with the incarceration of the Japanese Americans, the demonizing of the Chinese Americans is part of that same kind of political and thinking that's being perpetuated and I don't know if it's new thinking or if it's still part of what happened to the Nikkei community. But I think it's still there.
Great. I actually have, before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to speak to George's point that we really do hope that we can create change by having this history taught in schools. You know, I grew up here in Idaho, 2 hours from Minidoka, and I didn't learn about it until I went to college in Southern California. And so that's, you know, part of what we thought was that this 30-minute film was so powerful. That is why Friends of Minidoka and North Shore have teamed up now to create this 1 hour long version for public television broadcast. And the other component will be a curriculum for 7th through 12th graders so we can get this history into our classrooms.
Well, Mia, I'm a believer that history is history. If it happened, it happened. We should not pick and choose what to include or exclude from history books. It's very, very simple.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question for Rory from Christy, and it says, does Rory have any personal connection to Minidoka? And if not, what compelled him to become involved with this film?
When we started this project, I did not have any personal connection to Minidoka at all. I'm actually first generation immigrant myself and originally from England. But I've lived in Portland for a long time and have made films about other civil rights stories. And I just thought this was such an extraordinary story. And I think one that, and I've sort of confirmed this as through the process of making and showing the film to non-Japanese Americans and friends, is that it's a story people think they know, but they don't really understand the depth of it and the impact and the multi-generational impact, and they're horrified, you know, once they understand how terrible it was. So I think it's, I really wanted to make it because I just thought it was a extraordinary story and a very important story that, you know, each generation needs to hear fresh as they're growing up, and to be able to tell it in the words of people who lived it was an amazing privilege, and to get to meet George and Karen and all of the other great storytellers you saw in the film, and for them to be kind enough to share their stories with us was really a wonderful privilege, and yeah, I was very, very very, very glad to have the opportunity to make the film.
Great. We have a question from Melissa, and it says, what role would you all like to see young adult Japanese Americans play in continuing to share these stories and continuing to strengthen the Japanese American community?
Well,
I think that, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, George.
No, go ahead.
I think that it's important that the Yonsei and the Gosei understand the political climate, but also the effects of the incarceration on the Issei and the Nisei. Because the Isseis never got to realize any kind of redress. Most of them were gone by the time the redress occurred. But I think that it's important that they learn about that and figure out ways and do things that prevent it from ever happening to anyone else.
Well, in simple terms, I feel that the Japanese Nisei, like myself, are very proud of the Issei, the first generation, who pulled up their roots, came here, were pioneer immigrants, took all the abuse and the discrimination, and still were good citizens. My mother and father, when they applied for citizenship in 1952, took the test, and they didn't speak fluent English, became great citizens. They voted in every election thereafter. They were model citizens, and they taught us, as the film mentioned, shikata ga nai, gaman, gambatte, never give up. And it's that kind of spirit that I hope the Sanseis and the Yonseis, the future generation of Japanese Americans, will carry on into the future. That's my hope.
Great. So we have a question from Amanda Haynes that says, what can we do to press the Idaho education system to incorporate this documentary and the educational materials we're working on? And I think, one of our goals would, of course, be to get this added to the curriculum standards for the state. They will re-review the history standards in 4 years from now. But before that happens, once we have this educational resource available, it will be free online, and I think it will be up to Friends of Minidoka then to have teacher trainings and be able to sort of let people know that it's out there and encourage educators to use it. And so we look forward to that work ahead once we've got this project finalized. Rory, did you want to just chat for a second about kind of the status? I know we spoke a bit in the video, but
yeah, we're fairly deep into post-production on the film, and still with the same problem of too many great stories to tell. But we are aiming to have the film broadcast next May 2021 in Asian American Pacific Islander History Month on public television. And the education version, the educational curriculum is further along. Actually, it's pretty much ready to go, but we will launch it at the same time, I think, so that they can, the publicity of one will help with the other. So that's where we're at the moment. And obviously at Minidoka Film, go to minidokafilm.com, and if you sign up there, we will send you updates as the project progresses.
yes. Okay, we probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
A question from Justin Chin. George.
So for George, what would K through 12 content look like to educate students about the Japanese incarceration and how it is an extension of Yellow Peril?
I'm not clear. Say that again.
What would K through 12 content look like to educate students? So I think if we had our way and got this in the classrooms, what would your dream be for the students to learn about the incarceration?
Well, I think if they learned what the entire experience was following World War II, how a nation can panic, and what 4 years behind barbed wires are like, and what we endured and went through, I think if they understood that, just to give you a couple of examples, there were 120,000 Japanese incarcerated in 10 different camps. And we were given no trial. We had no due process. We were incarcerated for one reason, because of who we are. That should never happen in the United States of America. So the constitutional words are very good words, but they become hollow when they are not implemented. And it's those principles that I believe that future generations should learn, understand, and implement. Simply
Great.
put, that's my feeling.
Well, I think we're all in agreement there. Thank you. We've got a question from Derek, and I'll ask Karen, can you share any happy stories that your parents shared with you from the Hunt camp?
Oh, Derek is my nephew. I emailed this to all my relatives, friends, my whole address book. Mom and Dad used to talk about being able to interface with their friends. And also, the Ozawas and my parents were in the same barrack. And Dad would talk about he and his brother, George, and two other people bought a car for $100, I think, total. And they used to go to Cascade, where the lumber mill was, because a lot of the people from Washington, including my father and my grandfather Ozawa, had worked in logging camps, lumber camps, and Grandpa Ozawa took a group of people up to Cascade to work the lumber yard there. But they would go back and forth to Minidoka, and when they needed new tires because of the rationing, they would find some guy with a pregnant wife, and then he would go to the ration board and say they needed a new tires because his wife was going to deliver, so they had to get back to Twin Falls or to Minidoka, or they needed to go to Cascade. And I said, well, Dad, how did you find these people? And the reverse racism, he said, they don't remember us. We all look alike. And he said, so we could take the same guy twice and they wouldn't know. I said, but they had your names. And he said, we didn't worry about that. And so those are the kind of things. My dad spent time outsmarting the system. He was also able to leave the camp every day because he ran the trucking. So after I was born, Mother needed a double boiler. So he would wander around somewhere to a hardware store and get a double boiler for her. Or if she needed, they wanted a pan to be able to cook rice in their unit. And so he found them that. So those are the kinds of stories that my dad would tell about camp.
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. We're just about done, but we've got a question from Ken Mochizuki, and it says, would you agree that the Issei mothers don't get enough credit for holding families together during the war? So maybe, George, you could reflect on your mother.
Yes, I really cannot say enough about the Issei. They were not tall in stature, but they understood the American dream. And even incarcerated behind barbed wires, they never forgot that dream. I don't think they ever lost confidence in the principles of America. And they passed that on to us in our daily lives. And so my mother, I remember her so well. there in camp, teaching us little lessons of life. And after we came back from camp, telling us to hang tight even if things in school were different, a lot of prejudices that we faced. And we all of us in Issei owe a great deal to our Issei parents, that unforgettable, indelible kinds of memories.
Thank you. Last thing to speak on, Patricia asked, will the full interviews eventually be available online, like through Densho? Rory, do you have any plans? I believe that they'll all be archived with the Park Service.
And I believe they will also be archived with Densho. So the answer is yes, eventually.
Great.
Yeah, we will get there.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much, Karen and George, for your time this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us to watch the film and ask your questions. And I'll just remind you to check out minidokafilm.com for more information. Sign up on our mailing list, and we'll keep you posted for the next steps and when our hour-long extended version is available. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.